So last week, Design Delve put out a video talking about the chaotic balance of Marvel Rivals, and I guess this is technically a response video, but I'm thinking of it more of a continuation of their analysis, because I think it's interesting to talk about. For anyone who hasn't seen it yet, there'll be a link in the description to check it out for yourself, but basically they put out a video analyzing how Marvel Rivals is doing so well, at least in part, because of how insanely busted many of the heroes and their abilities in that game are, especially when you compare it to its direct competition, Overwatch, which over the years has tended to try and tone down and nerf any kind of overpowered abilities to quote-unquote make things more fair and competitive. But I think that we can further analyze some of the ideas mentioned in that video to get a little bit more in-depth as to exactly why the more chaotic over-the-top abilities work so much better in Marvel Rivals than they ever really have in Overwatch. Because I think that there is a lot more to how the game is balanced than merely the idea that if everyone is overpowered, then nobody is. To start with the counterexample, we can take a look at some of the classic overpowered abilities from the very beginning of Overwatch's career, and let me know if you start to sense a pattern with why these powers were so problematic. As mentioned in the Design Delve video, we had things like Widowmaker being able to one-shot certain heroes without needing to actually land a headshot on them, and the artist formerly known as McCree could use his flashbang and fan the hammer combo to do a stun and deal enough damage that he could even annihilate a tank with ease, but the list goes on. Just off the top of my head, I recall other annoyances, like how Bastion could land critical hits with his minigun, which allowed him to melt even tanks in a femtosecond, or the exploit with Hanzo's scatter arrow where you could aim it at someone's feet and that would cause all of the scatters to ricochet into them and deal more than enough damage to take out, once again, entire tanks in one shot. Are you sensing a pattern here yet? A big problem with early Overwatch's balance was more specific than there just being a lot of strong abilities. In particular, a lot of heroes were just really good at killing people really fast, and a lot of them were good at killing people in ways that I think were clearly never intended. Like, take Widowmaker again. The whole point of her kit is that she's the classic sniper character who's meant to be popping heads and whatnot. So the fact that she could kill certain characters like Zenyatta and Tracer from full health with just a body shot was clearly not intended behavior for her. It was imbalanced in a way that just removed all skill when fighting those characters. Similarly, with Hanzo's scatter arrow, the ability was meant to be more of like an AoE power. It was designed to give him a way to hit groups of enemies at once, while your basic attack was meant to be your big single target damage dealer. But people figured out a way to exploit the nature of the ability to turn it into a single target attack that was both more powerful than his basic arrow, since it could do enough damage to one-shot tanks, but it was also easier to pull off since, once again, it removed the need to try and aim for people's heads. A lot of Overwatch's early balance problems were less about the characters being too strong and more about completely unintended exploits or just certain characters being unable to fulfill their role. Like, the fact that characters like Hanzo and McCree and Bastion and several others could just melt tanks so easily kind of invalidated the mere idea of a tank role to begin with. Plus, the only tanks that could stand up to this onslaught were tanks with big barriers like Reinhardt, which only ended up dramatically limiting the viable tank pool, which would lead to some degenerate strategies of their own down the line. The abilities weren't just overpowered, they were problematic to the core design of the game. A lot of the characters just weren't meant to be able to be killed this quickly and easily. Conversely, if we go back to Marvel Rivals, I personally find the way that a lot of the heroes are powerful in that game to be vastly more interesting to play with than these examples from early Overwatch. Cause like, yeah, there are some heroes like Hela and Hawkeye that are powerful in terms of just raw damage output, similar to the examples I mentioned from Overwatch. But from what I've seen, they actually work mostly as intended. They still require pretty good aim to actually take down enemies quickly, and they don't don't have abilities that just straight up invalidate the entire concept of tanking. But other than heroes like that, the way that most of the heroes are powerful in Rivals tends to be in how they use their non-damaging abilities. For example, Iron Man's most noteworthy trait is that he can just straight up fly infinitely, making him extremely hard to deal with for any melee or other short-range characters, and just giving him the ability to waltz over the front line like it is even there. Doctor Strange can open up literal portals that transfer everything from heroes to gunshots to even ultimates through them, which can be used in tons of really interesting and powerful ways. Jeff, rather infamously, can use his ultimate to straight up swallow the entire enemy team and just chuck them off of a cliff if he knows the map well enough and plans out his route. These kinds of abilities are all super strong, yeah. I mean, just look at how free Iron Man's mobility in the air is compared to Overwatch heroes like Pharah, and that's without even going into the craziness of how some other characters can move like Spider-Man. But the point that I'm getting at here is that these abilities on their own don't get you kills. Strange's magic portal doesn't automatically just deal any damage to anybody who goes through it. You have to use it in clever ways to get any real effect out of it, even if some of those ways include letting you drop an entire ultimate on the point just out of nowhere. And Iron Man's flight requires you to find places that will allow you to be a problem for your enemy's back line, and he doesn't exactly have a lot of health, so if someone is able to spot him and has the range to do so, they can just shoot him down. But also, arguably, the most important element of Rivals' design is something that Design Delve only really mentioned at the very tail end of their video, and I think that it deserves a bit more of a highlight, which is the idea of the rock, paper, scissors style of design. See, Rivals is the kind of hero shooter where you can swap characters mid-game, as opposed to other games like Deadlock and most MOBAs of that sort, where once you have your character, you're stuck with them for the entire match. In MOBAs, that means that if you're laning against someone and they're playing a character that has a good matchup against yours, all you can really do is try to change your playstyle to adapt and do your best. But in games like Rivals, characters can act as much harder counters to each other, and that means that if someone on the enemy team is being a problem, then you can simply change to a character that counters them in some way to try and resolve the situation. And I think that this is a core fundamental element of why Marvel Rivals works so well. If you're really that scared of someone like Jeff eating the entire team off the point at the last minute, then you can play a character like Strange or Iron Man who all have a ton of vertical mobility so that they're out of reach of Jeff's ultimate. But then if those flying heroes are giving you issues, then you can use other characters with high mobility to track them down and overpower them, like Spider-Man, or apparently Iron Fist, who I guess can kind of lock onto a flying hero and just fly somehow. But if those high mobility heroes are giving you issues, then you can counter them with heroes that have auto-aiming abilities, like Wanda, and the list just goes on and on. I think you see what I mean. This is what makes Marvel Rivals work, because ultimately, it doesn't matter how powerful a character is, as long as there is at least one or more other characters that have the abilities needed to take them down. And to go back to the counter example, I think that this is the exact problem that plagued a lot of Overwatch's balancing issues throughout the years. Yeah, there were still certain characters that were good at countering other characters, but far too often there were certain characters that were released or entire playstyles that seemingly had no real effective counter, and it would just grind entire games to a halt. I recall Brigitte being a particularly bad problem child back in the day because she was a support that effectively had passive AoE healing, so she basically regened her own health constantly while still supporting her entire team. But on top of that, she had a shield that had even more health on top of having above average health for a support, making her really hard to take down from the front. And she had a shield bash that could stun people, making her really good at dealing with anyone trying to flank her in case they had the weird impression that they might be able to get around her giant shield. The problem here isn't even necessarily how powerful she is, although she is clearly very powerful here. The issue is that nobody really had a good way to counter her. Most healers' main weaknesses are that flankers can sneak onto the back line and take them out before the tanks could protect them. But Brigitte specifically countered flankers like that, and she was super strong on the front lines too, thanks to all of that health that she could work with. If she was exactly as powerful as she was at launch, but there was some other hero that just completely, absolutely annihilated her consistently if they fought each other, then the horror stories surrounding her launch might have gone completely differently. But instead of having a situation like that happen, they instead went for the route of just nerfing her into the ground, which, while arguably was needed for the state of the game that Overwatch was in, it's also the much less fun option. Really, barriers as a whole were a huge problem with Overwatch's design for most of its existence. The most picked tanks like Reinhardt, Sigma, and Classic Orisa were so popular because they just had the best barriers. Brigitte was so strong in part because she also had a really good barrier while being a support, and barriers just blocked literally everything and would grind games to a halt, and there just wasn't really a good way to counter them for a huge amount of the game's lifespan. They eventually tried to turn Symmetra into like an anti-barrier hero in like her third or fourth rework or whatever that was, but that just wasn't enough, clearly. The game desperately was in need of more heroes that could counter playstyles like that, but instead they ended up focusing more on trying to just nerf everything, and eventually ended up limiting everyone to the role queue system in order to try and enforce some level of balance. And when that still wasn't even enough, they ended up reducing it further to this 5v5 system and literally just got rid of one of the tank roles on the team to try and just remove some of the barriers from the game. It's all just emblematic of their tendency to nerf powerful abilities instead of trying to find a way for them to work within the balance of the game. Because the thing is that while a lot of Overwatch's early balance issues were due to exploits and some raw damage just being overtuned, there have also been a lot of really fun abilities throughout Overwatch's history that I think they could have worked with instead of nerfing or removing them from the game. Beyond the barriers I just talked about, there were also things like Lucio's original huge speed buff, Symmetra's shield generator, Orisa's entire original kit, and arguably most iconic of all was of course Mercy's team-wide res ultimate, among many others. A lot of these were super powerful or problematic at some point in the game, sure, but they were all nerfed or removed entirely over time, and I think that Rivals has shown that there was another path that they could have taken if they focused more on trying to provide counterplay to all of these powerful abilities instead of simply trying to make them weaker. Maybe we could have kept a lot of those abilities at least mostly resembling their older and more interesting versions instead of having them watered down or removed entirely. Even though Rivals is still pretty much a brand new game, I think the comparison is just night and day when it comes to their balance philosophies. We recently got to see the first major balance patch, and instead of focusing on trying to rein things in and nerf anyone that's overperforming like Overwatch did for years, they focused more on trying to make it easier to counter the overperforming heroes instead. Nearly every hero in the game is good at countering some other hero or general playstyle, and in turn they have some kind of counter against them, so no matter how powerful any one hero is, there's usually something that you have to watch out for. I'm by no means a pro, but as far as I'm currently aware, the only real gap in the meta is apparently at super high level play. A lot of teams are just running a ton of healers at once to basically make themselves unkillable, but I mean, if they simply introduce a hero like Ana that has some sort of ability that shuts off healing somehow, then that would allow the game to keep all of those healers as powerful as they are without having to fall back on the tried and true trend of nerfing everything like Overwatch did. Sure, the game is still pretty new, so maybe we just haven't discovered the really degenerate stuff, but I think that weirdly enough, this is still a much more stable way to balance the game despite how crazy everything is, because of all of the reasons that I've talked about today so far. It just feels less frustrating to play Rivals than most of Overwatch's lifespan, and I have some pretty high hopes for the future of Rivals going forwards. But as always, I am happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. What do you think about how Marvel Rivals is balanced? And if you're an Overwatch veteran like me, I'm curious to see other people's thoughts and opinions on how the two games have approached the issue of powerful characters. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe and all that jazz. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.